Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who has authored many books on military strategy, was a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Trump, and is also the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, which pursues a very different foreign policy than what has been pursued at least over the past 3 decades. Welcome, Colonel. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you, Glenn.
So I really want to discuss the Middle East with you because there's been well a lot of changes since the last time we spoke. I guess looks as if the crisis now, or a direct war between Israel and Iran, becomes increasingly difficult to avoid as they keep striking each other. Um, but also, yeah, the conflicts threatens to spread even wider beyond, yeah, Lebanon, Yemen, and
Mhm.
these different proxies around Iraq and Syria. So I guess I wanted to ask about how would you see an actual war between Israel and Iran? Because I hear now Naftali Bennett. He argued that this was a great opportunity to attack Iran, given that Hezbollah and Hamas have been weakened or at least preoccupied. Um, but of course, there's a lot of uncertainties about Iran's military capabilities and indeed how a war between Israel and Iran will play out. Certainly would be a very different war from anything Israel has seen in the past. So do you think the Israelis will go to war against Iran, or what's holding them back? And yeah, how do you think this will play out?
Well, first of all, I think you're going to see war between Iran and Israel. Mr. Netanyahu, if he is to sustain this conflict over time, has to expand it. Things have not gone well in southern Lebanon or in Gaza. Hamas is not defeated. Hezbollah is certainly far from defeated. He hasn't even met the main body of Hezbollah fighters. Thousands of fighters are pouring in from Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula to reinforce Hezbollah. So that's far from over. But we have to understand there's something larger at work right now. I think the government in London, as well as in Washington, has decided to back this greater Israel project with the goal of ultimately clearing Arabs out of southern Lebanon, clearing them out of much of Syria, ultimately dislodging them from the West Bank and Gaza, and eventually throwing at least the Palestinians out of Jordan. Now, this sounds extreme to anybody with any common sense, but these things are actually being discussed. So it's not as though Mr. Netanyahu is waging this ruthless campaign of expulsion and murder on his own. He has support. We are critical, but so are the British. In some respects, I'm beginning to think the British want to relive their empire back in the Middle East. It's very strange. But that those comments notwithstanding, right now he's got to go after Iran. When does he do it? Well, first of all, he understands that any air defense system designed to shoot down aircraft or missiles can be overwhelmed by enough incoming missiles and aircraft. So he understands that. That's why he has demanded and gotten the two of the six THAAD batteries that we have. This is the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System with its radar. The radar, of course, is remarkable. It's probably one of the best things that we have ever built. It costs a $500 million or $500 million, probably more right now. And with this radar, you can sit in Washington, D.C. and track a basketball over New Orleans. So that's telling you 1,000 miles plus in front of you. It's very important because it not only enables you to accurately attack, well, let's put it this way, you can accurately identify targets at a very great distance and you have lots of early warning, but you're much more likely to hit the target because the missile then has some time to carefully calculate the distance and the time it needs to reach the target. He's also getting the best missiles that we have. These are the top of the line. You can't do much better. and they include interceptors that are capable of stopping everything but hypersonic missiles. Remember, the hypersonic missiles range from 4,500 miles per hour up to 9,000 miles per hour. Nobody can shoot them down. So I think he's going to wait until the second battery is established. But I think the predisposition is to attack before the election. Now, the election is important in this calculus because he's assuming, probably, and with some degree of justification, that President Trump will win the election. But he can't be 100% sure. If he waits and it turns out that for some reason President Trump doesn't win, there's no guarantee that the incoming administration is going to stand by him. Whereas he has promises of support from Trump and his agents in the United States that surround President Trump, that the Trump administration, the future one, will be solidly in the Israeli camp and back what he wants to do. So, under those circumstances, I think he's decided we have to attack, that is, Israel has to attack Iran before the election and get the war started before the election. Now, when does that happen? First or second or third of November? I don't know, but probably somewhere in there. So he'll wait for the additional air and missile defense forces to arrive. They'll be set up, and then I suspect he'll launch his attack, which I expect to be very powerful as he can make it. The only question at this stage is, will he use a tactical nuclear weapon or two tactical nuclear weapons or three tactical nuclear weapons against Iran's alleged nuclear site? We have ultimately asked him not to do that, but he has these weapons, and he's made it very clear that whatever we want is secondary to his and Israel's interests, and therefore he will do what he thinks is appropriate. The problem, of course, of using a nuclear weapon, Glenn, is that you open the proverbial bottle and the genie comes out, and that makes it then legitimate for others to use those weapons against you. And we know that Iran is close to the threshold of producing warheads that can be weaponized on the missiles available to the Iranians. So hopefully that won't happen, but it could. At any rate, that's the situation he's in right now. Now, then the Iranians will respond. And the question is, at this stage of the game is how rapidly they will respond. Will they respond instantly? Start unloading their missiles on Israel as soon as they discover that they are under attack, or do they wait and then attack? I don't know. But I think that'll be devastating for Israel. It's going to be hard on Iran, but Iran is a nation of what? Almost 90 million people. Iran is the size of Europe, Western Europe. Of course, they have two large deserts internal to the country. There aren't very many people in those, obviously. So populations are concentrated in a few cities, but you do have a large rural population. So Iran is going to absorb it, and then they're going to strike back, and they will have every bit of help that Russia and China can provide to them.
So when I see Blinken making his regular trips to the Middle East, they keep focusing on the idea that they're close to a ceasefire. They're trying to put pressure on Netanyahu to walk back this conflict, but at the same time, of course, there's no well pressure actually being put in terms of limiting the weapons and capabilities being delivered. And now we see this. Uh, this THAAD air defense system as well being delivered, and as you pointed out, a very sophisticated system as well. How should we understand the U.S. position? Do they have they given up on the idea of ceasefire, or uh, are they still waiting for Israel to determine what the U.S. should do? Or it becomes very difficult to follow because the signals they want to send, it seems to differ very from the actual actions which are being taken.
If you are in one of the Arab states right now, or Iran or Turkey, it's very obvious to you who is in charge. Mr. Netanyahu is in charge. And he doesn't ask for something, he demands it and he gets it. And Amos Hochstein or Tony Blinken, when they come into the region, are not treated seriously anymore because, as far as the Arabs and Turks and Persians are concerned, these people are simply repeating talking points from Mr. Netanyahu, and they are Mr. Netanyahu's agents. We are viewed through that lens right now. So I don't think there's any expectation in the region that anything we say about our readiness to urge Israel to do something else means anything. I think they fully expect to be hit and be hit very hard, and I think they will hit back very hard. We'll see what it looks like the day after the Iranians have struck back.
Well, the thing with Israel, though, is it's the reluctance to make any peace settlements, any peace agreements with its neighbors, or primarily the Palestinians, which yeah creates the need, I guess, to have what they refer to as mowing the grass every now and then to attack both military and civilian targets to perpetuate the weakness of neighbors, given that they don't have any permanent peace with them. The, but if the United States would want to reverse or put an end to this, the, surely they would need to push through a settlement. But I guess this is there's no chance anymore, is there? Because I keep also hearing Washington suggesting that they're even close to a ceasefire, and then they barely made the statement before Netanyahu contested, saying that they're not willing to make any concessions or pull back. So, uh, is this all messaging then, or it's just it becomes very difficult to follow at times?
Glenn, if you go back to October 7th last year, the initial response and the weeks that followed demonstrated that Israel was not interested in any future arrangement that would include any sort of Palestinian state, or for that matter, even a ceasefire with the people in Gaza, Hamas. And since then, the war has only expanded. I don't think anyone in the Middle East harbors any illusions, regardless of what we say. And I think if anybody believes that there's a future for a two-front, or excuse me, a two-state solution, they're hopelessly delusional. There isn't. If you travel to the capitals in the region, and I'm talking to several people who've traveled to them, and recently and spoken to people very close to the top, people that work closely with Mr. or General Sisi, people that work for Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, people that are dealing with the Emirates and also in Qatar and Ankara. They have all said the same thing. Everyone's attitude is no more Balfour Declaration. That's over. So as far as they're concerned, there will be no compromise. And they don't take us seriously. They don't see us as an honest broker because they see us as essentially manipulated by their enemy. We are the creature of Israel. We are the dog that's being wagged by the tail.
And how are the neighboring states? Do you see any changes going? I know the among the public in most of the neighboring states, the sentiment has been getting more and more, yeah, not out of control, but people are getting more and more angry, and we've seen the political leaders, well, often well talking a big game, but they're not actually do anything which would risk a direct conflict with Israel or the United States. But do you see this as maintaining this way? Because again, it's already we already have this now, not just in Gaza, but it's spread to the West Bank. Then we brought in Yemen. Then, of course, this huge war now with Hezbollah, in which Lebanon is being destroyed. We see the direct launches between strikes between Israel and Iran. Um, Also, of course, including the territories of Syria and Iraq. But surely this is. Do you see any possibilities of other neighbors being pulled into this a wider conflict?
Well, let's go to the north first and look at the position of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not defeated. It has not been destroyed, but the Israeli goal moves beyond Hezbollah. They are destroying infrastructure, making it impossible for people to live where they currently live. That's not accidental. This is what's being done in Gaza. In other words, this is a war on the population, not just against Hezbollah. That reality is sinking in. It is sunk in Ankara. They understand now that they are on the verge of receiving a flood of refugees which they cannot manage. The pressure on Erdogan inside his country to intervene and act against the Israelis is overwhelming. And I would expect that there would be preparations for that. His focus is obviously on Syria because Syria is the bridge between Lebanon and Turkey. So Syria is of great concern because we have backed for some time Kurdish rebels who are committed to destroy Turkey. We and the Mossad, and I'm talking about we, I'm talking about the CIA and Special Operations Forces, have worked with the Kurds for a long time, and they are now taking action. There was a terrorist attack in Turkey quite recently today. It interrupted the BRICS conference briefly, and President Putin read a letter of condolence to President Erdogan, who said that there had been 4 killed and something like 17 wounded. The Turks have been licking their chops and sharpening their sabers for a long time, looking in two directions. One, of course, is the Kurdish problem, which they are quite willing to go in and eliminate, but also towards Israel for the terrible injustice committed against the Muslim population of Palestine. There are Sunni Muslims too, and there's an expectation in the old region that Turkey historically ruled that the Turks have an obligation to take an interest in what's being done to the people that live there. And thus far, Erdogan has failed on that score. We will see what happens next. But I think now that it's clear that Syria is part of the greater Israel project, along with the West Bank and Lebanon, I think we'll finally see the Turks engage. When you move down to Gaza, you're dealing with Egypt. And remember, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, they've been heavily bribed for years by us to go along with what we wanted them to do vis-a-vis Israel. That's something that they're reluctant to admit publicly, but it's true, especially for Jordan and Egypt, who desperately need money. They have large populations. They cannot easily feed, clothe, school, house without enormous assistance from the United States. And they've been told, listen, if you get on the wrong side of this thing, we will cut you off. And of course, the populations in Egypt and the population in Jordan, and in Jordan, there are more than 11.5 million Palestinians. People don't realize that. They don't care anymore. They want to get involved. They want to join the fight. And I think at some point that will happen, particularly if we see the Turks engage. And that will come, I think, after the Iranian counterstrike, when it becomes clear that the Iranians have devastated Israel. All of these are reasons why Mr. Netanyahu desperately wants us in the war, because he understands that he cannot prevail in this environment without us. So he's in a position where he either kills his way out of this, kill as many Arabs as possible, and then if anybody else gets involved, kill them, whether they're Turks or Iranians. But the bottom line, he's got to kill as many as possible and cleanse the state north of the river initially, well into Syria, well into Lebanon, even if he can, all the way up to Beirut. Get rid of as many as the people there, and then try then to attain some sort of peace settlement that leaves him in charge of most of this territory, and then he hopes to fill it with Jews. We are the instrument. If we don't go in and support him very strongly, if we don't back him, particularly after the Iranians counter strike, then he can't win. Now, if we support him, can he win? Uh, that's iffy. We haven't seen large numbers of our aircraft fly against Russian S-400 air and missile defense systems. So that depends greatly on how we do, how well we perform. It also depends on what happens when we come under attack and how many missiles fall on us and how they target us at sea as well as being on the land. A lot of open questions. We don't know the answers. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that Iran, and for that matter, Turkey, will be pushovers in the future. I don't see it that way. I think these are going to be very tough nuts to crack, and I don't think they're going to crack. And Israel, on the other hand, may be the one that cracks because it has the most to lose, in my judgment.
You mentioned before that if there's a war between Iran and Israel, a larger war that is, that Russia and China would seek to come to the assistance of Iran. Now, do we have any information yet in terms of any weaponry which has been transferred? You hear about their defense systems. I think they're also sending the S-400s. Do we know anything else about the capabilities? Because there's a lot of uncertainties about the capabilities of Iran, both what it's built on its own, but also, of course, what is being supplied by friendly states.
Well, we know that they've been given Iskander missiles. Those are medium-range ballistic missiles. One of those fell on the Swedes and other NATO forces in eastern Ukraine recently near Poltava and was devastating. They probably have access to more than that, to more longer range missiles. Clearly, they have hypersonic missiles. We know that because they penetrated and struck targets at an Israeli military site. How many do they have? What kinds of different warheads? I don't know. Anything is possible, but I think they have enough that they can selectively target what they consider to be important military installations and people. So I think they've got more than enough. Someone told me recently that they had the capacity to fire 400, the equivalent of 400 missiles and rockets uh, every hour for 3 or 4 or 5 days before reloading anything. Now that may be an exaggeration, but it's not impossible. We'll have to wait and see how this initial engagement goes for the Israelis when they attack. That'll tell us a great deal. If their aircraft are lost, if it doesn't go that well, if they don't achieve what they, of course, we'll never be told honestly what they did or didn't achieve. We know that from experience, but we'll be able to know what happened. And then the Iranians counterstrike. That's when we come in. I mean, we will come in. We have 1,000 fighters ready to go. We have large numbers of bombers sitting down on Diego Garcia and other locations. We can fly them all the way from Nebraska if we need to and drop enormous quantities of ordnance on Iran. The Russians have made it clear they will not stand by and watch Iran be destroyed. So the Russians now put some ships into an Iranian port recently and then sent a message and saying, don't attack Iran. I think the Russians would like nothing better than to see no war, but they have thousands of men on the ground, technicians and soldiers, who are hastily not only assembling air and missile defense capabilities, also building up the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability. They have moved pilots down there who can fly Iranian aircraft and other kinds of aircraft as needed. And I think we'll see a lot of long-range ballistic missiles, maybe some that we didn't expect, but it'll all be conventional initially, unless, of course, Israel uses a tactical nuclear weapon, in which case, then I guess the so-called guardrails are completely abandoned, and you could see a nuclear warhead on a missile fired from Iran. And that's simply because they're at the point now where they could rapidly produce one.
I yeah, I wanted to just shift gear a little bit towards another war, which is I guess becoming overshadowed by the Middle Eastern war, which is of course the conflict in Ukraine, because for 2.5 years it appears that NATO has responded to all the setbacks and losses with escalations, but on the last one now, in which the US and Britain effectively threatened to strike Russia more or less directly, that is, with missiles operated by American and British technicians or soldiers using their satellites, that this was that Russia announced this would be a direct attack. And after this, we see, I might be reading it wrong, but it seems as if the United States is pulling a little bit back, not abandoning Ukraine, but suggesting the Europeans should do more and effectively pushing back. For example, the victory plan which Zelensky offered to Washington, which was, well, essentially entering NATO right away, have the US directly attack Russia, and well, it seemed to be a bit wild. And when the Americans pushed back against this, he began to speak of nuclear weapons. So There seems to be a bit of an unraveling going on as the front line collapse. But well, do you see any big changes in the United States? What the politicians are saying, how uh, I guess their enduring commitment to Ukraine.
I think they're making the same comments they made at the end of the Vietnam War. We will never abandon South Vietnam. We are committed to stand by South Vietnam. You realize Zelensky left with a consolation prize of a few $100 million. That will at least keep most of the people on his payroll. That will pay off his generals, the politicians. I mean, the notion of the Ukrainian parliament being a parliament is kind of a joke. They're all on the illicit payroll, being paid off to vote the way they do and act the way they do. I think that will continue until it can't. And I don't think we're far away from the can't. The situation in Ukraine is dire. Certainly, the winter situation that's coming is going to have a devastating impact. I'm not sure that the Zelensky regime will survive too much longer. But this was a package designed to keep them alive, to put them on life support to get through the election. Remember, in this country, sadly, a lot of it's for public display, and not necessarily overseas, but here at home. Oh yes, we're standing by Ukraine. Ukraine hasn't lost. We haven't been defeated. See, we'll make this right, and they'll get through the election. And when the election is over, they'll generally lose interest and they'll stop talking about it. That's what we did with Vietnam. That's what we've done to a large extent about the Middle East when we talk about Iraq and Syria. The objective is to keep U.S. casualties low or non-existent. Don't say anything, hunker down, and stay wherever you are as long as you can. It's ridiculous. It's hard for Europeans to understand, but that's the way we do business. I think also there's something else happening. I think in Europe itself, NATO's crumbling. People know that. The NATO allies are not shoulder to shoulder on any of this. The reality that you could end up with a war against Russia that nobody really wants is really upon us. This is the problem with the whole deep strike strategy. And yes, you're right. We have pulled back. Now the Ukrainians are trying to cobble together whatever they can for a long range strike here or there to try and signal that they're still alive or something. But it's not going to make any difference. And of course, the latest narrative, which was complete nonsense, is that Russia is doing so badly it needs troops. It's badly harmed. Therefore, North Korean forces are going to come and fight for Russia in Ukraine, and that's not true. That was complete nonsense. And what happened was a newspaper outlet in Korea, which is I think it's the National Information Service, something like that. It's aligned with the current president of Korea, who's very much a quote unquote U.S. lackey and owes a great deal to the CIA. That news organization put out this ridiculous nonsense, and they used a photograph. They show you a North Korean flag or a Russian flag on the hill and North Korean troops and saying, see, they're there and they're getting ready to go fight. No, they're in eastern Siberia, what we would call northeast Manchuria. Not all of Manchuria is obviously in China. Some of it is still lies in Russia. And they historically get on rail cars down in North Korea because North Korea has a border with Russia. And they go up into Russia to train. And they're usually being instructed in new tactics and techniques. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians were not passing on their experiences in Korea to the North Koreans. And they all wear Russian uniforms. And that's true that any foreign power that sends its forces to Russia dons a Russian uniform so that nobody knows how many foreign elements there are actually training inside Russia. This has been true for a long time. And that's what you see, North Koreans in Russian uniform. Not that it makes a great deal of difference, but that's what they do. So there are no North Korean troops getting ready to do anything. The only people that are getting ready to do something are Zelensky and his colleagues. They're getting ready to leave town as soon as possible, as soon as they can get out before the ultimate hammer falls. And that's where they are. I'm sure they've got one foot on the airplane as we're speaking right now. That's how desperate the situation is in Kiev.
How about the battlefield, though, in Ukraine? What do you see happening, or what are the main developments at the moment? Are there I guess in it's well, not a great secret that at the end of wars, that losing side tends to have escalating casualties, and I guess we've seen some of this lately. It appears the Russians are taking territory with greater ease. We see, therefore, many Ukrainian soldiers keep getting caught in cauldrons. I know we've seen this in Kursk, in the Pokrovsk area, then in Volodar. So it's happening a bit left and right. But I guess in the wider picture, what is see happening on the battlefield at the moment? Is it crumbling, or is it a mere setback? Can this be recovered? How do you see the situation?
I think the key to understanding what's happening is that Ukraine no longer has any air defenses to speak of. Excuse me. If it attempts to use aircraft at all, those aircraft are targeted, identified, and shot down. This means that the Russians have essentially carte blanche to attack anywhere they want to. Remember, they've also destroyed the energy grid. So there's an acute lack of power on any given day. The army no longer occupies its strong points. The fortifications it had in Donetsk and the Donetsk basin are destroyed. The last great fortress had a 6 and a 9,000 pound fuel air explosive bomb dropped on it. Now, whether that was sent in as a glide bomb or otherwise, I don't know, but that annihilated everything that was on the ground. Remember, a fuel air explosive, when it comes in, it has the impact of a nuclear weapon because it sucks out the oxygen from the atmosphere. So anything within the radius of the blast, which could be several miles in either direction, suffocates. And if it doesn't suffocate, it's burned to a crisp because the fuel air explosive is ignited. These are terrible weapons. We used them in Vietnam. The Russians are using them to finish off whatever resistance they find, and for good reason. They say, why should we bother taking casualties when we can do this job from the air? And initially, remember when Putin went in, really imposed tremendous restrictions on his soldiers that went in there. And as a result, things didn't go very well. Those restrictions have long ago been lifted. So he wants to get this thing over with as rapidly as possible, but he wants to do it in a way that does not reinforce this madness that says, see, the Russians are marching on Latvia or something. He's not interested in the Baltic states. He doesn't want to go to war against Finland. He doesn't want to attack Poland. He's not interested in any of that. So he's content to clean up eastern Ukraine, eliminate those who are resisting, and move up. And he wants to consolidate control of what he's got and talk to the country's whatever leadership turns out to be to end this thing. And I don't think Zelensky can do that, so I think he'll leave at some point. I don't know who will be left, but I suspect that there is a growing willingness, certainly in Berlin and other places, for people to say that enough's enough. Let's step up and end this. And the worse things get in the Middle East, frankly, I think the more likely people are to rush to end this war in Ukraine. You know, we're a one crisis town here in Washington, D.C. We can never manage more than one conflict at once. So I think as soon as this thing blows up in the Middle East, everyone will turn decisively away from Ukraine, and whatever happens there will be written off.
Yeah, it's this big joke that Putin ended COVID because once the Russians invaded Ukraine in February 2022, suddenly we stopped talking about COVID almost overnight. So there is something to that about having very limited focus on one issue. So I guess
And
the,
you
the,
know,
the
Glenn, there's something else, and people need to understand this. Americans aren't really interested in either of these conflicts. Most of them don't care. But they're going to be very upset when this financial crisis that looms on the horizon finally breaks. The breakout of a major war in the Middle East will be a catalyst for that financial crisis. We'll see the markets fall apart. The bond business, which is already a terrible show, theatrical exercise. Nobody wants to buy our bonds. When those things all come together, the American people are going to want answers, and they're going to be concerned about putting food on the table again. They're going to be concerned about supply chains that don't work. concerned about money they can't get access to because the banking sector is in serious trouble. The bottom line is that this thing is not going to last much longer. And I think President Putin knows that. And that's another reason why he's moved carefully. Xi, by the way, President Xi in China doesn't want us to collapse because that's going to have consequences for him. We are China's biggest market. And if we collapse, he's not going to be able to sell much to us. He's not going to be able to sell elsewhere on the scale that he does to us. This is a strange set of circumstances, but it all points to disaster here in the United States eventually. It just won't come soon enough to avert the war in the Middle East.
Well, you mentioned you don't know who will come after Zelensky, but there appears to be some disruptions or challenges to the leadership because, again, following the main indicators at the end of a war, besides the rising casualties, we also see, yeah, the political leaders beginning to lash out. But within society, I think a big pressure is growing there, at least just from following Ukrainian telegram channels. The resentment growing towards the government keeps increasing with this more aggressive, well, so-called recruitment policies in which they snatch people off the street. It's pushing further social upheaval and resentment about public. We even see now not just new recruited soldiers without training complaining, but even some of the well-trained, well-experienced nationalist soldiers also starting to suggest that the war has been lost and questioning why they're continuing. Why lay down your life when the Russians can't be stopped anyways? And then we have people like Solushny also at least indicating that he might be better to negotiate given that he accepts the war is more or less lost. So there seems to be things happening within Ukraine. But well, from your experience, what do you think there will possibly be a coup or will simply disappear? Will the United States try to, if they can't put in someone else in place, will they look for a negotiator or someone who can push the war for a few more months, or is it just too difficult to say at this point?
In June 1941, 2 weeks into the German invasion, Stalin was almost catatonic. And he wrote that he was cowering in the corner. And he heard the crash of boots, jack boots, in the background coming down the hallway towards his office. And he admitted that he was waiting for Soviet military leaders to come in and execute him. And to his amazement, they came in and asked him to lead the country and said, "We need you." What a tragedy for the Soviet Union and the peoples that lived under it. Wonderful opportunity to get rid of Stalin. I think this time around, our friend Zelensky will leave before that happens to him. And I think it will. Something like that is in the offing. You're absolutely right. I don't know who it is. I think it's going to be very hard for us through the CIA and MI6 to designate the successor to Zelensky. And that's what we'll try to do. We'll try to set somebody else up. Won't work because I think the Russians won't tolerate it. And as you point out, the Ukrainian people have had enough. They've had enough for a long time. But the lesson there is they can't protect themselves. And anybody who believes in the Second Amendment, as I do, that we have the right to bear arms, watches that carefully and says there's a lesson here for Americans. And Washington said repeatedly that we should all bear arms. He thought that was a vital necessity, and that was based on his experience during the Revolution. So, this is one of the reasons that things have gone on as long as they have. And this all should have ended a long time ago, but there are no humanitarians at the top of the paradigm in Washington. There are no humanitarians in London, and certainly none in Kiev.
Well, that's the great irony. The people who label themselves humanitarians and who claims to be, well, pro-Ukrainian or speak on behalf of Ukraine, the empathy always translates into disaster for the Ukrainians. That is, the pro-Ukrainians are the ones who effectively said we should not implement the Minsk agreement. We don't need the Istanbul negotiations. We don't need negotiations at all. This should be resolved on the battlefield, and arguing Ukraine is winning, and covering up effectively on the disastrous casualties actually on the battlefield in order to keep public support going for the war. So, with friends like this, who needs enemy, they say. But there seems to be something changing, at least in Europe. There is while in the past, no one would even talk about sitting down and talking and speaking with the Russians. We now see, at least from Germany, France, not Britain, of course, but from many other countries, they're suggesting that a more moderate position has to be made. Perhaps there has to be territorial concessions. And then, of course, we're having the rebels from Hungary, Slovakia, who are openly saying we need to restore relations with the Russians. And I hear that in Austria, there's also some politicians who are looking at the possibility of restoring relations with Russia, that perhaps we went a little bit overboard in this war. But but do you see the Europeans willing to distance themselves too much from Washington, or is this uh, is this because the United States simply reacting to the United States shift in terms of its preparedness to fight this till the end?
I think a little bit of both. I think increasingly it will be obvious to Europeans that they have to strike out on their own. They have to come to their own defense, and they have to realize that our interests are not necessarily their interests. This should be self-evident, but you know that the populations have been treated to this constant barrage of lies about what Russia is now. You would think you were listening to a description of the Soviet Union in 1942 or 1939. It's absurd. It bears no resemblance to reality. I'm surprised that the Europeans have questioned nothing to this point on the scale that they should have. But it's going to become pretty obvious. It's already obvious to many, and the hardship always cures a lot of problems. As soon as you make it hard for people to pay for their food, to pay for heating, and so forth, it'll make a difference. I was listening to someone bragging about the liquefied natural gas being sold to Poland and how wonderful that is, and that came about after the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. Well, that's because Norway decided to jump into the breach and sell the Poles liquefied natural gas. Well, that's nice. And I think they made a good profit. So have the Americans. I think they've had to pay more. I think if they're going to recover financially and militarily and industrially in Europe, they're going to need cheap energy. There's only one source for that. That's Russia. So that's going to happen. But things aren't bad enough yet. This is the question that comes up again and again. And remember, de Gaulle explained this many, many years ago. Now, I remember when I was a young man that had just arrived in Germany as an exchange student, and people never missed the opportunity to pour buckets of filth and abuse all over de Gaulle. Oh, he's evil, he's bad, he doesn't believe in NATO and the Atlantic Alliance. Well, de Gaulle said, Americans don't live in Europe. Britain is an island. We Europeans have to forge our own future. Now, what is that future going to look like? We Europeans should determine it. Well, everybody went to sleep, and now they see where they're headed, thanks to the United States. We've bankrupted them. We've destroyed Germany's economy, which was the engine of Europe. We've effectively turned everyone into economic slaves. I mean, it's just miserable, terrible set of circumstances. And Russia is not coming west. Who in their right mind in the Kremlin wants to take over and manage Europe, Western Europe, especially at this point? Forget it. They don't want anything to do with it. So it's more trouble than it's worth. So this is all inevitable. It's all going to work out. It's all going to end, and it'll end with a whimper, not a bang. That is in Ukraine. The problem is what happens now in the Middle East. And I think we're headed into very difficult waters. And it's going to be catastrophic initially. Then we'll see how everybody reacts to the realization that this is real war. Remember, Israel never had to fight for more than, 6 days to 2 weeks? And they were organized to prevent a war from lasting much longer. What have they got now? They're in terrible shape. Their economy is ruined. People are massively unemployed, unhappy. The future is actually pretty bleak. But they too are being lied to. If you turn on Israeli television, everybody's winning on every front. And now we're going to destroy Iran. That'll solve all of our problems. Well, good luck.
Yeah, this war didn't work out as expected. I think the goal was, well, the way many have been speaking is to break the Russians. This would effectively revive the collective hegemony of the political West, a rebirth of the 1990s, and yeah, cementing the unipolar order. But instead, we see now the Russians, yeah, of course, winning the war. As we speak, the the Russians are hosting world leaders from the world majority in Kazan to effectively learn to live without the West by creating a parallel international economic architecture. Meanwhile, the Europeans, which thought they were building a future by organizing Europe under NATO, has now see the continent being redivided, remilitarized, weakened, becoming less relevant. And while after the Germans, of course, had their pipeline destroyed and deindustrializing, they even have their main ally, the United States, offering subsidies through this Inflation Reduction Act to the failing German companies to move abroad. And yeah, and then the US will take its resources in relative decline and pivot to Asia instead as Europe loses its strategic relevance. So it's not. I think this historians looking back at this, how this was covered in the media versus the future this is brought to Europe is yes, would make a good reading, I guess. But yes,
Well, I
quite
think we'll
depressing.
pivot, but I think we'll pivot to home.
Yeah. Anyways, yes, we out of time.
Hit
So
the
yeah, just
saturation point.
want to thank you again so
Thank
much.
you, Glenn.
Always
Talk
appreciate
to you
it.
soon.
Thank you. Bye.